Hello, everyone. Welcome to the sixth episode of the AI Healthcare Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Reid, and today we are joined with my friend, Sergei Polevikov, who is a board member and AI advisor to Well AI, member of the AI and Genomic Diagnostics International Working Group for the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry and Laboratory Medicine, or IFCC, and the author of the 2023 Elsevier paper, Advancing AI in Healthcare, a comprehensive review of best practices. Thank you for your time today, Sergey. I really appreciate it.
No problem, Dylan. Thanks for having me.
What situation or experiences in your career made you realize that AI in healthcare was the right field for you?
Yeah, so my background is in math and statistics. This is where I started. So I always felt passionate about those sciences, math and later data science. And I feel like there's a lot of opportunities to apply sort of my math knowledge. So I actually started in finance initially. There are a lot of interesting applications there. And at some point of my life, I had to make a choice what I'm gonna do. I was at a point where I felt like I had the knowledge, and I needed to maybe apply this knowledge to some interesting fields. And obviously, healthcare is the field where there are a lot of challenges, and as you know, and I feel like honestly, it's behind so many industries and walks of life in terms of how we're applying newest innovations and inventions. And so, at some point, I had a conversation with my current business partner, Daniel Sachkov, and by that time, he already had some work done in fields like bioinformatics,
Mhm.
and he's been talking to a lot of people in medical community. And at the time, the feeling was that we can apply our AI skills and data science skills to medical field. In particular, we thought at the time it would be diagnostics and perhaps medical triage,
Mhm.
um, because it was something that people were talking about. And with the vast amount of information and medical literature coming up, there was clear the need for something to process that information, to summarize it. And we felt like at the time when we started 3 4 years ago, there was nothing sort of major that tackles that problem. And so
Mhm.
this is how we started. My personal passion is, my family history. I had some, really kind of health scares, and have some, for example, genetic predispositions through my whole sort of family line on my mother's side. For example, AMD condition. It's the eye,
Mhm.
genetic condition. And my partner also had some problems. His dad died because of cancer. So we thought that we can apply our knowledge to address some of those issues in medical science, and this is how I started in healthcare.
Mhm. Awesome. And can you give like an overview of what is or excuse me, what are the similarities and differences between Babylon Health and Olive AI, and why kind of both of their stories is a telltale lesson for AI healthcare development?
It's a great question. Babylon is a great case study. It's both interesting in terms of the scale of the operation, but also how it all ended. It's a kind of significant but also sad story, the way it ended. And I think there are a lot of lessons for not only digital health space, but I would say the whole startups and business space in general. And that's why I spent so much time on Babylon, because I felt like it was such a fascinating case. And not only me, there are other people kind of actually there were some early whistleblowers into the whole Babylon situation, such as Dr. David Watkins. He wrote a lot of stuff on Twitter and also did some presentations, kind of warning people about the red flags that were happening in Babylon Health. Um, but on my side, I remember when I started in digital health, the people I talked to in the industry, venture capitalists and startup owners and founders, they're kind of talking to me. And once they found out that what we're trying to do in digital health, they're like, oh, take a look at Babylon Health. Um, they're doing very similar things and they've been very successful. So that was, I think, 3 years ago when I kind of read some papers on Babylon and kind of looked around and to see what they're doing. And even back then, I thought it's kind of strange that no one really knows exactly what they're doing. Usually, if somebody tells you that they've developed this apparently greatest AI algorithm in healthcare ever,
Mm-hmm.
there has to be some kind of confirmation. There has to be
Mm-hmm.
some research or study, and it was all very surfacey. It was
Mm-hmm.
at a very basic level. There were some white papers. There were some papers they published which I thought were nowhere close in terms of academic rigor, and there were so many holes there and errors that I thought it was just strange that it was even published. And of course, you have to realize that Babylon, and in particular its CEO Ali Parza, had so much influence in the industry at the time, and so I feel like um, it's kind of happening in cycles. We have all this, and I'm not saying that Babylon was a fraud, but it's not for me to decide. But there's certainly a lot of interesting things happening and perhaps irregularities. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like you know the industry goes in cycles. There are companies rising and falling, and we seem to learn from their mistakes, and then this mixed mistakes happening all over again. And I feel like it's because of the influence of powerful people. you know
Mm-hmm.
you get a big name and you're like so mesmerized by the story, by the so-called vision, that you kind of forget to do a very basic validation, very basic verification. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, long story short, Babylon was a leader, or at least alleged leader, in digital health technology for many years. They claimed that they came up with this AI algorithm that, in their own claim, was at par with human physicians, and in some metrics they were claiming was much better,
Yeah.
which was a very interesting thing to say. Um, but turned out they didn't have anything under the hood. It was all for the show. There was a story, for example, whenever there was a reporter coming in or a TV crew, they would cook something up on the spot just to show in that particular TV segment or internet segment what they were doing. But there was nothing really. There was no AI model. There was some old algorithm that they're reusing all over and over again, but they were so masterful in hiding what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just so wrong that this happened. I think the biggest, perhaps, takeaway is, and probably the most obvious, is the leadership and the culture that's been created within the company. I think in every company we should start looking at the leaders first,
Uh-huh.
and the more you the deeper you dig, the more you analyze what Ali Parza in that particular case was doing. Is just so many red flags. in terms of how he was treating the employees, in terms of the internal policies that you're not supposed to talk to anybody, everything was secretive. All of the Glassdoor reviews, for example, which is the number one corporate review website, there was an internal memo apparently that you were not supposed to write anything below 4 or 5, and if you do, there were some um, consequences. You could be fired, things like that. Um, and so it's this culture, and the way the company grew with all the irregularities, and how actually the US regulators let them become
Mhm.
so large and kind of overlooking and looking the other way. I'm talking about the FDA and the SEC. The FDA actually had the authority to validate their AI tools, and they never looked. They're just basically saying, it's not a mandatory requirement.
Mhm.
The company seems to be doing what they're supposed to do. So no one even take a simple look, because all it took was at the time just somebody taking a look what exactly that AI model was, because there was no model, or there was something that definitely they didn't claim. And
Mhm.
so there's so many interesting things, and I write about 60 pages. I can talk over and over, but to me, again, coming back, the saddest part is um, the especially the fall of Babylon, because it eventually went public actually. And I feel so bad for the retail investors, that because they fell for the story, because the story was so great. They raised so much money actually in private valuation, rounds of funding, that everybody's thinking, oh, if venture capitalists throw money at them, they must be so good. And
Uh-huh.
that I feel like artificially inflated their valuation
Mhm.
to some completely unreasonable levels. And so when there's only VC funding, when you essentially cannot sell, and there are only a handful of guys, you can and that's what I argue in my paper, is that you can you know uh, almost make up any valuation you want. You can inflate it, but then once you go to public market, you have millions of people. You can buy, but you can also short, and you can also sell. Usually in this kind of situation, it's actually the insiders who are shorting, if they know that the company is essentially a fake. um,
Mhm.
and I feel there's a lot of happening under the hood, and I'm genuinely surprised that regulators haven't looked at the Babylon situation. There was, I think it was, I was looking at the data. It was definitely in the last several decades the fastest rise, but then also the hardest fall of all the IPOs that I've looked at. I think there were two others in the during the tech bubble that were kind of close, but basically going from 4 billion to zero in 19 months, it's definitely a record. And it's kind of a testimony that once the um, public looks at you and kind of realizes there's nothing there, your fair value kind of very quickly becomes zero. So again, I feel about the deceit. I feel about the retail investors who fell for this deceit. And I've kind of felt bad that no one paid attention, or to the large extent, to all these whistleblowers. I
Mhm.
mentioned Watkins. There were actually a few others. They were kind of to the large extent ignored. Um, anyway, I feel like I can talk for
Yeah.
forever, but
No
I think
worries.
it's just if somebody's interested, just go into my LinkedIn or to my Substack, where I have that full story. I think 63 pages long. If somebody's interested, just spend a lot of time very carefully analyzing the whole Babylon story.
Mhm. It kind of reminds me of this. those two stories a little bit. Do you remember like Theranos? I think that was like 15 years ago or something, where they claimed
Yep.
like the blood tests were um, could basically I forgot, but it was like basically that it could like cure cancer, I believe. Like that was like the scandal that they were under. So it kind of reminds me of the Theranos story a little bit. If anyone,
Well, it's funny you mentioned because I spend so much time. I actually draw parallel because again, I have to be careful, you know, uh, calling it particular names. I'm not.
Mhm.
I shouldn't be saying it's a fraud because to claim it's a fraud, it has to be a proof at a regulatory level, etc. The SEC should take a look at that, perhaps, which I feel like, and I mentioned that in the paper. I feel like they would never do, especially at this point. Company went bankrupt. I don't
Mhm.
know if they're ever gonna do, but yeah, I draw parallel actually with many, um, which I think kind of similar cases, including Theranos. The story about Theranos is it's actually the biggest parallel to me. It's the lies and trying to hide behind the story that's not there. So
Mhm.
Elizabeth Holmes was claiming that they've created some unique technology, but in effect they were using actually Siemens technology, somebody else's, and even that um, for the conditions that she was claiming that they were curing, even that didn't work. And
Mhm.
so to me, it's the story of deception. Um, you know, Especially in healthcare, which is another parallel where we have to be aware of a lot of things we're dealing with real people. So misdiagnosis, things like that.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, there's a lot of parallels with the um, famous fraud cases from the history, and I talk about it in the paper.
Mhm. Yeah. So yeah, you recently wrote the paper "Advancing AI in Healthcare: A Comprehensive Review of Best Practices," which kind of which provides a framework for emphasizing patient and community-centric care. And in the paper, you argue human input is the most important element in reducing transparency and bias. And I'm just curious, um, why you think human input is the most important characteristic.
That's a great question. First of all, I have to say that the study came out kind of um, from a series of discussions. As you mentioned, I am part of the IFCC's working group on AI and genomics research. And I've been part of the group for almost 3 years, and every year we have sort of agenda of what things we would address for the coming year, what research topics we're going to be talking about, what's critical at that point in the industry, in the healthcare industry, and for that particular discussion in genomics research in particular. And one of the things people were discussing is that there were, that was probably 2 years ago. There was nothing really, there were so many great AI developments
Mhm.
at the time, and that was even before ChatGPT and all this large language models. Um, but it felt like there was no guidance. There was no kind of one paper or one best practices guide that would sort of tell you about the perhaps most benefits, but also the risks and the dangers of particular AI models, but also how the whole AI application and AI operation, I would say, process. How do you apply AI and machine learning, for example, in businesses and in clinical settings. There was nothing like that would address that best practices issues. There were papers here and there, and so I thought I would take on that project to basically say there's so many great papers in very prominent journals like Nature and others. What if I kind of do a review and summarize and maybe come up with some general themes of how we should address best practices and what should we look at in terms of risks in particular in the leading AI models, and so this is how it all started. So this is kind of my prelude to say that it's not just my work; it's actually a work of so many other people that I took and try to sort of to take the best out of it. So to answer your question, I think if you look at some of the um, studies, I think the theme is that um, in many of the studies is that we should appreciate the power and the scale of what the AI models and machine learning models can do. But in the end of the day, the whole field of I feel like of artificial intelligence is to make humanity better, right?
Yeah.
So, well, that's the first point. So, in the end of the day, it's all about the humans.
Mhm.
So, you know, so even from that perspective, you want to have human perspective. You always want human validation, no matter how sophisticated the AI model is. You want that check that you know. So, is the model working the way it's supposed to work? Is it addressing the problems it was supposed to address? So that human check-in is
Mhm.
always important, and that's why, for example, when you use ChatGPT, they often ask the question, did you find this answer helpful? So that's their way of kind of doing that reinforcement learning thing, which
Mhm.
is a methodology to essentially correct or adjust AI models and sort of guide them in the right direction. Uh,
Mhm.
so those two uh, aspects, and also remember, in the end of the day, any AI model is as good as the data it's trained on, right? So you cannot expect something um, from your AI model that's not there. There are all these conversations about AGI, the the fact that perhaps AI is going to take over one day, and so that's why there are all this conversation and these conferences about the AI safety, etc. I think we're far from that. I think at this point, um, I think we should be concerned, but as of now, um, there's nothing even close. The AI is artificial intelligence. The intelligent part is not there yet.
Mhm.
It's the sort of recycling, vegetation of the data that's given to the model. I mean,
Mhm.
it's making it perhaps um, to some extent better, to some extent more interpretable, more useful for humans. But that's all it's doing. It's essentially reusing the data that is given.
Yeah.
So from all those perspectives, it's important to always have that human validation because again, the model is as good as your data. So if your data and there, it's very rare, and I think uh, there's no data set that doesn't have issues right now. So there are all these biases. There actually in this new Biden report, there was a section that talks about it, the importance of addressing biases and things like algorithmic discrimination that sometimes you see in this AI models, deep learning models, and so understanding the bias, understanding how this model works, this is still on the human. You know, we have to still look at the results of the model and say, you know what, this is not intuitive. Why is that? And more often than not, is you have to look at the data, and the data is not perfect. Again, there are biases, there are hallucinations with LLM models, and so for all those reasons, I feel like it's actually joint, I would say, effort both from humans and from the machines. So for all those reasons, I think human input into into AI models is very important.
And you brought up an interesting point. Because it seems like from kind of what you were saying and kind of like what I've read about AI in healthcare is that reducing transparency and bias seems like it's the most potential challenge, because when you talk about bias, are you talking about kind of input bias, so like the data itself, the people who are making the model? Are you talking about how the model is implemented? So bias, there's really like 3 to 5 different ways you can define bias. And then transparency, that's such a vague term that, what does transparency even mean?
Yeah, exactly. So in my published paper, Elsevier paper, I spent a lot of time obviously talking about biases, because that's that's the significant part of the best practices that are so important, as I mentioned, for healthcare and for clinical practice, for instance. There are all sorts of biases, and you're right. There, some of those definitions are vague. There are some of the biases that actually exist in the data, as I mentioned. We have racial biases, gender biases, for example. But there are also biases that's been artificially created by the models, algorithmic biases, for example. The model itself may be behaving in such a way that generates certain biases. There are also all sorts of statistical biases that actually are not new to the AI models, to deep learning models. So yeah, there's a lot of discussion, even about the definition. You're right. And in the paper I published, I try to dissect all that and provide the best explanation that I could give. Um, and my best kind of explanation and insight on that is that it's important to look at what other people have done and how they looked at things like biases and transparency and interpretability of the AI models. So there's a wealth of research on academic side in particular that I've looked at, and so there are some consensuses on how you define these biases. So once you define it, once there is a methodology, for instance, to identify why the model is behaving in a certain way, maybe against one group of people, Once you identify that and you determine that, for example, that's coming from a particular data set, once you agree on definition, then there are actually all sorts of models, both statistical but also perhaps more kind of intuitive models of how to deal with those biases. There are a lot of statistical techniques like debiasing that, for example, that large AI companies have been using to address those issues. And so you're right, it's a complicated process and there is no simple answer. With regards to transparency, and as I spent some time in my paper, and actually my initial draft was much longer than that. I spent even more time discussing explainability, interpretability, and transparency of the models. And there are different definitions, but I think the bottom line is that people across the industry, the academia, regulatory field, they don't like black boxes. They, especially in healthcare, we're both working in healthcare. It's when we're dealing with human lives, when we're dealing with human experiences, any small error matters.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the interesting conversation is, yes, we need transparency, but then there's also a cost to that. Um, Transparency is good, but remember, the reason people, I think, tend to forget, but the reason we started talking about AI is not because of transparency, but because how good they've done. How in many walks of life, perhaps it didn't start in healthcare, but in many areas of automation, summarization of data, things like that, how great these models have become. you
Mm-hmm.
know um, and it didn't start with transparency. It started with the fact that computing power is increasing so much. It's actually more than exponential. um, that we're at a point, we at some point we got to the point, maybe 10-15 years ago, where the models that didn't work before, now all of a sudden they're working, and they're increasing human productivity. They're doing some great. So when it all started, like, people were not asking questions, oh, why is this model working so great?
Mm-hmm.
it, it's helping productivity, it's helping you in your everyday life, so that's great. But then obviously we're starting getting in some sensitive areas, and now obviously with all this conversation about AI is just becoming so big that it can overtake the world, as some people argue. Now it's becoming totally different conversation. And also in healthcare, I think it's an important conversation. Transparency is important, explainability is important. I spent a lot of time in my paper talking about it, but we have to understand that it's not easy. It's not the original deep learning models. They were not about explainability. They were not about transparency. They're this massive, um, sophisticated nonlinear models that in the end of the day make our life better. So it's only several years later that people started talking about, well, I'm talking to my clients or my customers or my patients, and they want to know why I'm giving them this particular outcome or this particular result. So then they went back and say, well, why is my model giving me this output? So it was kind of like almost backwards, reverse engineer the question of interpretability.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, actually, in academia, it's a completely unique and sort of separate field, AI interpretability. There are people actually working just in that area, and it's kind of a, evidence that it's not easy.
Hmm.
So it's not easy, but it is important. And again, I could talk a lot, but I think it's for somebody who's interested, I spent a lot of time talking about these issues in my best practices paper that I just published.
And one last question I had is, how would you like to use your paper to educate policy officials on the importance of patient and community-centric care? Like, what is one particular issue that you bring up in your paper that policy officials such as Congress do not understand?
That's a great question, and that's another reason that I wrote the paper, um, is to have this conversation. The one thing I'd like to mention that perhaps I didn't spend too much time in the paper for various reasons, but especially when we talk about regulators, I think the problem there is that they get so mesmerized and so sidetracked by these big shiny models and this um, speeches and tweets by this new, or I guess some of them not so new, industry leaders, that they forget that it's not only about Sam Altman and Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg. It's about so many diverse groups,
Mm.
um, and so when we're talking about community centric care and AI applied to customers and patients, I think my message to regulators is that don't forget those groups. Don't forget, for example, patient advocacy groups. Don't forget the physicians, because
Mm.
they're on the front lines. Because what I'm observing is that right now is the White House and the Congress. Um, the only talk, or the only seemingly communicating with people who actually created all this. I don't want to say problem, but they've created all this massive models that a lot of people are actually scared of. I don't think there are reasons to be scared, by the way.
Mm.
But again, it's very strange that the voice of the industry is actually the voice of those largest AI players, largest monopolists.
Mm.
It's I think it's to me it's actually dangerous. And in my recent LinkedIn post, or actually I think it's also on my Substack, I talk about the danger of um, you know uh, just listening to those voices that are actually have the largest investment in the industry, so to speak. And
Mm.
for example, I talk about the situation with Epic Systems when they also kind of posed themselves back in the early 2000s as the leader in the EHR space. And so when the new law was drafted, they actually only used Judy Faulkner, who is the CEO of Epic, to draft those laws. So guess what happened? The laws were tailor-made exactly for those monopolies. And so again, going back to your question, my and perhaps I didn't talk about that to that length in my paper, but to me it's important that regulators include diverse groups um, of representatives. Data, as I mentioned, data scientists, patient advocacy groups,
Mm.
ethicists, as in my case, perhaps, physicians, data scientists. It has to be a broad conversation, not just coming from this AI monopolists, or they're not monopolists right now, but this the way it's going, it's I think there is a danger of that. Uh,
Mm.
and to that point, I think it's important. I want to emphasize for regulators not to forget that in my view, the reason or a reason for all these recent innovations in AI space is actually because a lot of this developments, a lot of these models are open source models.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to warn regulators. It's important to have a conversation. It's important to create guidelines and um, guardrails for these AI models, but you know it's important also not to kill the open source models, because I feel like a lot of innovation and the fact that a lot of people have accessibility to this kind of great technology is coming from the open source models.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I could talk about other issues that I think are critical for regulators to talk about. But to me, this is especially given the recent events and the regulatory talks that are coming in, and also in the US Congress. I think it's important not to forget that actually a lot of the companies that are now AI leaders, a lot of their great technology actually came from the the so-called open source models. So again, to summarize, I think regulations are critical,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also super important to have a balance, and sort of not to overkill.
Mm-hmm.
And again, coming back to my initial point, it's important to have everybody at the table. It's important to have a representation from many parties, not just from the AI leaders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And where can people find you, Sergey?
Yeah, I think I'm I'm active on LinkedIn, and so just I think Sergey AI is my handle, almost across the board. I think I'm pretty active on social media across LinkedIn, Substack. This is where I publish my articles. I also obviously publish in academic articles, but Substack is, I think, more closer to my readers. So it's Substack again, LinkedIn, and perhaps Twitter. I tweet sometimes as well.
Great. Thank you again. And do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Podcast episodes are also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And do not forget to check out my newsletter, The AI Healthcare Report, on LinkedIn. This is Dylan Reid signing off. Thank you again, Sergey, for your time.
Thank you, Dylan.